This is Compendium, a podcast about communication and communication research. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with the COMM 1000 course at the University of Connecticut. Here now is the host of Compendium, Professor Steve Stifano.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to Compendium. This is our second edition of the podcast, and once again, I am your host, Steve Stifano. Happy to be with you again. This is going to be a little bit more interesting this time as we dig a little bit deeper into the field of communication. As we advertised in podcast number 1, we really want to get into the topics that we're covering in the COMM 1000 course a little bit more deeply. We really want to dig in and understand things, and we want to take some time to talk to our guests about the material they're researching and some of the things they've done, and hopefully shed some light on some material that ties into what we've been talking about in the course. Our most recent unit in COMM 1000 has talked about perception. And perception, both a psychological variable and a psychological concept and a communication concept, really does kind of shape the ways in which we think about the entire field of communication. And it's one of the reasons that we start the course with perception. And, a few different things from our lecture material really jumped out. Selective attention and the idea that we don't always see everything that's in front of us, that sometimes we pick out on certain things, and that selection process really is based on a number of different characteristics of who we are and what we find interesting. We also talk about our own filters and the process of selecting material, organizing it, and interpreting it. So all of these things really are the foundation for our perception lecture, but there are more interesting things to discuss when we actually put them to use in communication. And that is the goal of our conversation with today's guest, another doctoral student from our Department of Communication here at the University of Connecticut, Sara Picklesimer. And Sara has done a bit of work on 2 different primary topics related to perception. One I think is really fascinating, the idea of thin slicing, and the other one is probably something you've heard a lot about regardless of your interest in communication, the impact and effect of gender on the ways in which we communicate and overall our behavior in this world. So we're going to talk to Sara about, some of the normal stuff and, where she came from and what she's all about, but we're also going to get more deeply into these materials, and we're going to use an overarching theme for this conversation of, are the perceptions that we make accurate? And I guess you could argue, is there a definition of accurate that you'd be okay with as well? So without any further ado, let's go ahead and hear from this week's guest on the topic of perception. So my guest this week has been a member of the Department of Communication here at the University of Connecticut for the past 4 years. And she comes to us with a diverse background and a diverse set of research interests. Please welcome to the show, Sara Picklesimer.
Hi, Steve.
So I guess, as always, we're going to continue this trend from our first week. We're going to start at the very beginning. So,
okay,
where were you born?
I was born in a very teeny tiny town in Kentucky called Pineville. And I've been told that if you blink as you're driving through it, you will completely miss it.
So you were born in a blink.
I was.
All right. And what was your first experience in your life where you realized you thought communication was interesting?
I would have to say that probably in high school. So, and all of the negotiations surrounding the dating scene. So, there was sort of like an unspoken rule where for whatever reason you couldn't talk directly to the person that you liked. You had to go through a number of different mediators to just communicate to an individual that you liked them.
Were you a note passer?
Oh, I was definitely a note passer. I mean, that was sort of the trend. So, and it worked out because I was really shy. So, hey, I can express myself in writing instead of actually talking to somebody.
So in this case, mediation, if you will, gave you an opportunity to pursue.
It did. And then that was right around the time that AOL instant messaging was starting to sort of increase in popularity. So I'm pretty certain I only spoke to my boyfriends through mediated channels.
Okay, so, and for those of us listening at home who may not be 100% aware, AOL Instant Messenger was probably easily described as the precursor to text messaging. Would you say that?
Yes. Well, and I know that because I didn't actually have a cell phone till I was 15 years old, which is probably unheard of for some of the people listening right now.
Well, okay. So cell phones, AOL Instant Messenger, and all that. At some point you went to college, right?
I did.
And where did you go to college?
I did both my bachelor's and my master's at the University of Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky.
And you're a pretty big Louisville Cardinals fan,
I'm
right?
a huge Louisville Cardinals fan. They pulled out a win just the other day against North Carolina that I was worried about, but that's neither here nor there.
Okay, so you're at the University of Louisville. And what was your first ever communication course?
I took, well, actually, I have an interesting past here. So I started off as a biology major, and public speaking was just a general education requirement for everyone at the university. So that was actually my first communication course.
Okay, so public speaking.
Yes.
And what about public speaking, the course or the material, anything, got your attention and made you think, I think I might want to go into this communication thing?
Well, if you ask anybody that I grew up with, and that includes my family members and my friends, they would all tell you that I was incredibly shy, very quiet and reserved. So the idea of taking a public speaking course was absolutely nerve-wracking for me. And then I got into it and I found out that I actually enjoyed it, and I was surprisingly good at it.
Oh, yeah.
So that was sort of my first inclination that perhaps I was in the wrong field.
And was that a difficult process, the idea of switching? Did you have to kind of come to grips with it emotionally? Was there a logistical issue? I mean, a lot of our listeners are probably going to be at some point or another in that process of, can I change my major? Should I change my major? What was your experience?
Well, I'll just be flat out honest. I got into my first semester was okay, and my second semester was a little rockier, but still not too terrible. But by the time that second year rolled around, I started to realize I really didn't like what I was doing, which decreased, of course, my motivation to actually want to try or do well. And then the real kicker was, and I hope I hope this is more helpful than anything for the students listening. I flat out failed my Organic Chemistry 2 course. And luckily I had taken all English, humanities and communication courses that semester as well. So despite the fact that I failed that course, I was able to keep my scholarship. And then I said, I think I've had enough of this. It's time for me to switch to something that I'm actually really interested in.
And I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because so many of the people I've come across since working in this academic field have had something. They've run into some class or some piece of material that they just couldn't grasp, and they failed it, or they struggled and barely passed it, and they had a miserable experience, and they questioned themselves. But it really is part of the process, isn't it?
It really is. And I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't difficult or hard for me to come to terms with that. You know, I'd been a straight A student up until I got to college, and then suddenly I wasn't making the grades that I thought that I should be making. But what helped me was that I sort of realized that this isn't something that I'm interested in doing or pursuing any further anyway. So sort of rationalizing that bad grade helped me be able to move on. And I had a great advisor as well, and a supportive family. So,
and then next thing you know, you transition from someone who's not having a good time with organic chemistry to somebody who is really leading and at the front of the communication. program that you're in, and you move into a graduate program, as you said, at the University of Louisville.
Right.
And you study communication.
Mm-hmm.
When you got there, were you thinking, I want to do this because I want to become a college professor someday? Or did you have another reason in mind?
I actually, if I remember correctly, about the same time I switched over to communication, I was also working for our student newspaper. And at U of L, the student newspaper was run on a much different schedule than here at UConn. I believe here it's a daily issue. We only published weekly. Mm-hmm. So I actually thought I was going to be a news reporter, a journalist. Mm-hmm. That's what I was going to do. So I didn't have any intentions of going to grad school or being a college professor. I was just going to be a hot shot out in the news world.
Well, and a lot of the students that come to us in this field of communication approach us at some point or another and say, I want to be on TV, or I want to be on the news, or I want to be a reporter or a journalist, and in no way, shape, or form are we ever going to turn them away, but we do like to emphasize there are a whole host of other opportunities, and you're actually a good example of that you don't have to stick with that idea. There's a lot more in this field that we can hopefully open your eyes to.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So
I agree with that.
So as we move forward in this conversation, what was the first moment in the classroom where you realized, man, I really want to be a college professor, or I really love being an instructor?
I would have to say, I was actually lucky enough during my master's program at U of L to get to teach there as well. And weirdly enough, the class I taught was public speaking. Mm-hmm. And that was my first, as I said before, my first foray into the communication world, I guess. And I even though I was nervous and even though I was new, and it was very obvious that I was new, the students, their feedback and just having discussions with them both inside the classroom and out, that I would say just feeling like I made a difference in at least one person's life or path, or just put them in a good mood for the rest of the day. That's what really made me want to continue.
I think it's something that students don't always realize, but especially early on in our teaching careers, we have these moments where we're out there in front of an audience, whether it's 10 people, 15 people, 50 people, or in the case of COMM 1000, maybe 400 people, and we feel vulnerable and new at what we're doing or unfamiliar with something. And it's the students who reassure us, who provide that. It's okay, keep doing what you're doing. You're doing great. And whether or not they know they're doing that, they kind of can give us that signal sometimes.
Right. And it's actually, I think it's always good if you can laugh at yourself in the classroom as well. Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody expects us to be perfect, and I don't think anybody expects us to know everything. And so one thing that's helped me is just to be able to say, oh, I don't really know the answer to that question, or mm-hmm. I misspoke previously, and
I'm human.
Yes, exactly. I am human, and we make mistakes.
And I think that's really relevant to what we're doing in the COMM 1000 course. And I know one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast was because in that setting with so many people in the room and the presentation, so one way at times where you're really kind of delivering a lecture, you don't get that same opportunity like you get in a small setting. And I've always been somebody who's done that. My students have known me fairly well. They've kind of known my personality, my quirks, my goofiness. But in a large lecture, we don't really have that opportunity. So I thought this podcast itself was important, because when you can't have that setting because the room is so big, you need to have some kind of opportunity to get to realize that, in fact, the people who are instructing your courses are regular people and doing regular things, and they have their faults and their quirks and their interesting things and their frustrations. So hopefully we'll continue to have opportunities like we are right now to discuss a few of those things. I'd like to move on and talk to you about something that, well, everybody in this field of communication does, and I'd like to talk to you about your research. There's a few different things that you do, correct?
Yes, I have a wide variety of interests.
Okay, can you run through just 2 or 3 of them for us?
Yes. Currently, I'd say my main focus is on nonverbal and emotional communication, particularly in the context of health messages and health campaigns. So we call it emotional education. Mm-hmm. So, kind of improving upon the advice giving aspect of public service announcements. I've always been interested in person perception, impression formation, research. So that's more in the interpersonal realm of communication, I would say. Attachment theory is one of my favorite theories to use. I could probably connect it to just about anything. And then I've always been interested in gender roles, gender role stereotypes, perceptions of gender, things like that. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to look into that as much as I would like to. But I always do at least sort of look for differences between the males and females in my sample when I'm conducting research.
And you teach a gender course here at the university, correct?
Yes, I teach gender and communication here, and I taught it previously at U of L as well.
Okay, so you've got some background and experience in that, which in fact is one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you today. So I guess we can start there. One of the things we've talked about in our perception unit, although not as much as I would like, frankly, is that there are differences oftentimes attributed to gender in how we look at the world. Is there anything you can potentially provide or talk about with us that will give us some insight into perhaps how that comes about?
I can, but the first thing I actually want to acknowledge is that researchers in our field and other fields often use the word gender or the phrase gender differences to talk about differences between the males and the females in their samples. Gender is something that's socially constructed. So gender is not something we're born with. So usually when researchers refer to gender differences, they're talking about sex differences. So that's the first thing that that'd be my first point here, is that we need to make sure that we're using the right vocabulary anytime we are discussing these kinds of issues. But with that being said, there are certainly differences between masculine communication styles and feminine communication styles. And so it really depends on the speech community that the individual is socialized into, starting with at a young age.
Okay, and can you give us some example of a masculine communication style or some characteristics of a masculine communication style?
So some of the characteristics associated with masculine speech would be directness and assertiveness. So men are typically, or masculine individuals typically communicate more directly. And one of the ways they do this is by giving advice, trying to solve problems, trying to fix things. So this communication is more instrumental. Masculine communication is generally more abstract or general. So they tend to think of things more broadly, more theoretically or conceptually. And then, should I go on to feminine speech, or did you?
I mean, absolutely.
Okay. So some of the characteristics of feminine speech would be more of a focus on relationships and relationship maintenance. So making sure that others feel included in the conversation. We often describe this as emotional, though I don't know that that is exactly the word that I would use, because we all know that men and women both experience emotions. It's
Correct.
just that one of them is more inclined to express those emotions than the other.
And I think that's a really important distinction, and something we're going to talk about in a little later in the course, the difference between experience and expression when it comes to emotion.
Yeah.
So do you think any particular style, masculine or feminine, is inherently better?
I would say no. What I would say is that the most important thing to recognize is that individuals cultivate generally characteristics of both styles. So you might see this exhibited in like a female in a leadership position. So she may be direct and assertive. She may maybe take on more of the masculine speech characteristics. But at the same time, she's certainly probably going to be more relationally oriented to her employees as well. That would be sort of an example. But I think probably the most important thing is that we all realize that different doesn't necessarily mean better or worse.
I was hoping that you would say that. It's something that we kind of struggle with in this society, but we talk about a lot of times, how women communicate versus how men communicate. But to kind of tie this in to some degree to our unit on perception, do you think, and we can talk about women or men or masculine or feminine communication styled people, however you want to look at it, do you think that women and men see the world differently?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that they see the world differently, but I think that due to their socialization, they may interpret things differently.
Okay, so it's very interesting, and I think it has to play a role in the stereotypes that have been generated in our culture, don't you?
Yes. You mean, so stereotypes regarding men and women?
Yeah, and frankly, stereotypes regarding other things as well, but particularly related to men and women. Do you find that the stereotypes that have been generated for men and women, do you find that they're useful in any way, shape, or form? Or are they, as we often hear in pop culture, destructive and harmful in terms of how they shape the world?
So I would say that the reason that stereotypes exist, so to speak, is because human beings, well, there would be an argument that we have to deal with cognitive overload. So oftentimes our attention is focused on a variety of things, the traffic, the weather, the impending blizzard, how we're going to dig our cars out, do we have to go to school, things like that. And so when we enter into situations where we may have to interact with another individual, the only information typically available, if it's a first interaction, is information that we can see. So we can see a person's sex. We can't see their biological organs, but we can see that from the way that they're dressed, whether they are either sort of dressing in a feminine way or in a masculine way. And we can see their hair, their race. We can see maybe like level of attractiveness, and again, masculine and feminine characteristics. And so if that's the only information available, then that allows us to create shortcuts for how to approach an interaction. So unfortunately, stereotypes, I think, are used to inform our interactions, generally because we don't have any other information available at that time.
And then there are, of course, times where those stereotypes persist even after we have more information. And that maybe is when they can do more harm than good, would you say?
Yeah. And I think we also have to remember that stereotypes are also things that are learned. So sometimes we're socialized with stereotypes as well. So if our parents and our peer groups and people we communicate with believe in particular generalizations about a group of people, and then that's sort of what we've become accustomed to listening to, then that, of course, is going to inform our interactions as well.
Well, that leads me to an interesting question. In today's society, as we talk about, children being socialized and learning, if you will, these stereotypes and then starting to exhibit them themselves, or at least use them to make sense of the world. There's been arguments at times that perhaps things are getting better, that, that some of the limitations that we may have had 20 or 30 years ago societally, culturally, 50 years ago societally, culturally, are eroding. Do you think that today's children are going to grow up into a world where perhaps we have less negative connotations related to stereotypes about men and women, or what it means to be masculine or feminine?
I think that's a very interesting question. And there is certainly, I think that there have been events and issues that have come up more recently that would indicate that people are going to be maybe more tolerant and accepting and more understanding of things outside of these binaries that we seem to have created. I don't know I'm sure some of you have heard about a couple who had a baby and then did not reveal that baby's sex to the friends, family members, or anybody outside of their own immediate family. And that was so that baby could grow up sort of making choices about what he or she wants to play with or how he or she wants to dress. So kind of maybe not being so influenced by our societal expectations for what a boy or a girl should be doing.
And that's something we talk about in this, opening few units in the COMM 1000 course as well. The ways in which the world can shape how we view ourselves just by the feedback that we get. And the way our peer group behaves and how we match up to our peer group and so on and so forth. A lot of concepts that we discuss in the course. And I think that, this is a case of a real world experiment, if you will, but most of us don't have that opportunity. Most of us, before we are even aware of it, are seeing how the world views us and the labels they're giving us. And I think that even beyond gender, this conversation could relate to sexuality. It could relate to race. There's a whole host of things that we have to consider when we think about our perceptions, where they've come from, and how they might be shaping not just the way we view the world, but the ways in which other people actually view themselves. So an interesting component of this. So before we kind of shift gears here, plug your gender class for me. Tell me the most interesting thing that you do with your students when you teach gender and communication.
Well, this semester, we haven't gotten this far yet. So right now, we're still working with some of the basic information, the theoretical foundation, so that we can talk about more interesting things. But I'm really looking forward to bringing in some different media. So we'll do a unit on advertising and how ads are targeted toward men and women sort of based on these stereotypes. So the things that they should buy in order to appear feminine or appear masculine. But probably my favorite is my gender and popular music unit. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting way to look at the intersection of gender, culture, and communication. So we'll talk about hip hop music, we'll talk about pop music, we'll talk about country music, we'll talk about rock music, and all of the different ways that gender is demonstrated and communicated to us through songs.
Oh, is it interesting right away when you say that with no real background in that specific area of research or work? As soon as you said the names of the different genres, I thought, yep, I have a different picture for each one in terms of what that means for what a woman is, or how a woman is portrayed, or what a family is, or what love is, or what sex is. And so I can see how that would be a really appealing unit. Do you have to update it every time you teach the course, given the new music that comes out?
Yeah, so when I taught it at U of L, and that was 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I'm definitely going to I'll probably have to bring in, some Meghan Trainor and some Robin Thicke. Robin Thicke and Miley Cyrus. We can't leave all these people out. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion that I hopefully the students will be able to relate to.
It sounds like it will be. So I wish you luck with that. Before we let you go, there's one other topic area that I really wanted to dig into, and it relates directly to perception, and in fact, the role of perception in immediately shaping the ways in which we study others or get to know others or interact with others. The quick trigger, if you will, they call it thin slice research, and I'd appreciate it if you, being an expert on it more so than me, could describe it and what it is and how it works.
Sure. So thin slice judgments, it's basically judgments that we make between 3.5 seconds and 5 minutes. That's what the research would suggest. So it's sort of small glimpses into human behavior. But there has actually been research more recently where people have been able to make accurate impressions within just a 1 second video clip of an individual, or even just like a still photograph of an individual. So we're able to pick up on cues automatically. And so the only explanation for that, well, the most probable explanation for that, I should say, is that we're picking up on their nonverbal cues and their nonverbal behaviors instantaneously.
Mm-hmm. So this kind of relates to what we maybe more popularly talk about as like a gut feeling.
Yes, intuition would play a role here.
Okay, so I see an individual I have a snap judgment that, I think I could hang out with that guy. Or I have a snap judgment that, oh, that person creeps me out. Or I have a snap judgment that says, oh, they're attractive. Or, oh, I bet they're really intelligent. It's an interesting way of thinking about the world because it kind of splits the difference between so much of what we talk about with perception. We talk about how you might have these stereotypes and you might have, and we just had a whole conversation about this. And they might benefit you in certain, or they might harm you in certain ways, but they might also benefit you in certain ways, especially if, as you said, these quick judgments, these thin slices are demonstrating to be accurate in some of the research. Do you have any examples of that?
I do. And both of them are based on sort of more of an evolutionary perspective. And so basically these skills, these perceptual skills have evolved to help us recognize danger. And so we can protect ourselves. So that's obviously pertinent for survival.
So tied into the fight or flight mechanism.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. And then also recognizing potential romantic partners for reproduction. So again, another sort of survival skill or survival technique, kind of passing on the genes. So two examples come to mind. There was a research study where participants were presented with still photographs of 100 men. Some of them were violent sexual offenders and others were non-violent sexual offenders. And both men and women were able to accurately judge the difference between the two.
Then they're all sexual offenders, but some are violent and some are non-violent.
Yes.
And that quickly they were able to make that assessment, by and large, who was who.
Yes, absolutely. And the interesting piece of this, though, is that overall, women rated all of them across the board as more violent. And we could argue that that's because it would be more important for women to have this skill since these are people who are committing sex crimes.
Interesting. So this is something that we're going to talk about in the course in a couple of weeks when we get more deeply into nonverbal communication and motivation and emotion. We're going to talk about some of these sort of natural automatic processes that help us make sense of the world and help us survive. And one of the things I really enjoy about these sorts of things is you can argue all you want that we are cognitive beings, that we think about these things, that we make sense of things, and that we can say, oh, I acknowledge there's a stereotype and maybe I thought it, but I know better, and so on and so forth. But, for better or for worse, we have these systems in place at times, like looking at those photos, for example, to make us react a certain way. And they're probably there because this species needed to survive for the last few millions of years and get to this point where we could be as sophisticated as to sit down with the technology we have here and have a podcast about this conversation. That's a really interesting perspective on thin slicing. And you said you had another one.
Yeah. So in terms of reproduction, it's been demonstrated that people within 1 second, a 1 second dynamic video clip with physical appearance cues, so with like sort of no hair, just sort of a static body image. Within 1 second, people could accurately judge another's sexual orientation.
Okay, so that quickly, whether or not an individual was heterosexual or homosexual.
Yes.
And did it go any deeper than that, or did it leave it at that distinction?
It left it at that distinction. So some of this research probably isn't as inclusive as it could be. But I think this is an important thing that we need to recognize is that not only do we make judgments, which we all know that we form first impressions.
Right.
But it just so happens that some of these first impressions, most of them actually, are accurate.
Okay, so again, tying into the trust your gut thing to go with the gut feelings and so on and so forth. Really interesting. And research in this area seems like it would be relatively easy to set up.
Most of it is experimental, which means you can conduct it in a laboratory setting. And
could you walk through that for our listeners a little bit of maybe what that laboratory setting might look like in terms of setting up a thin slice study? Just maybe an idea.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned before with the violent and nonviolent sex offenders, they essentially they presented participants with still photographs. So that's as simple as, that could be even conducted online, really. So you kind of present each of your participants with a number of photographs and then give them a questionnaire, an accompanying questionnaire, and ask them to rate each individual in terms of maybe their level of attractiveness, some of their facial characteristics, and then some questions that would get at this idea of, does this person have violent tendencies or not?
Right. I think that the first time I ever heard about thin slicing was a study, and I'm not sure on the particulars of it, but where they gave students a video of an instructor teaching a course. And I'm not sure how long it was. Maybe it was a minute long or 30 seconds long. And they were able to evaluate the professor very similarly, and, highly correlated with the way in which the students who took the course for the entire semester evaluated, just from that snapshot, just from that very brief setting. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that study at all.
Yes, I am. Yep.
Okay. And it immediately jumped out as something that I said, this is really cool. Somebody should do something with this. And I guess, as you've evidenced from this discussion here, some people have. Some work has really been done to kind of flesh it out. And now I'd like to ask you a question. If you were to design a thin slice study, if you were to investigate this yourself, what kind of a study would you set up?
Well, one of the things that I think is one of the social issues that I think is important is this issue of bullying.
Okay.
And I would argue, and I think that there are many factors that certainly go into a person's the way they interact with and treat other people. But I would say that I think one of those things might be some kind of spontaneous, automatic, physiological response where they see someone who is different from them in any way. So this could be sexual orientation, gender identity, race, disability, maybe even something as less extreme as a lot of tattoos or piercings. So just an individual who is sort of outside the mainstream.
Like a different flag, like a boom, this person's different.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I think that what happens is in those encounters, there's a physiological reaction. And again, this is probably going to go back to this evolutionary basis of fight or flight. And I think that that automatic physiological response then triggers a tendency toward behavior or making a decision. And so I'm thinking possibly if we can emotionally educate individuals when they feel this response, this negative emotional response.
This sort of, this person is different, I need to do something about this.
Right. So if we can help those individuals label those responses, and then that will then help them sort of deal with them more effectively. And then perhaps if they're able to label and deal with those emotions effectively, they'll be less inclined to act on them impulsively.
Interesting. So kind of a preemptive strike towards an immediate gut reaction or a negative physical reaction or social reaction to seeing somebody different than us.
Right. And you're never going to be able to eliminate the physiological.
The moment.
Right.
That's interesting. That's different. What's going on there? That's a typical physiological reaction, which I think is important too, because even that is stigmatized in our society, that there are times where we will observe something and jump and go, whoa. And that is our body. That is our natural humanity speaking, not so much our character. And it's important that we as individuals can differentiate between, something jumping out as out of the ordinary or someone jumping out as out of the ordinary as something that, has evolved with humans as a species. But the way in which we proceed from there is something that we have total control over and is something that we, frankly, in a lot of cases, need to get better at.
Right. It's the cognitive component that we need to work on. It's the labeling.
Labeling. All right. That's a good word for it. So overall, if you had to take a takeaway from the thin slice literature or something that perhaps our listeners can walk out of this podcast with, what would that be?
I would say that maybe, especially within college courses, you hear a lot of, everything is scientific and everything is based on research. And that certainly is true. That's how we know some of these things as well.
Right.
But I would also say, maybe don't discount your gut. Maybe don't ignore your intuition, because it's certainly informative. And research has suggested that emotion absolutely plays a role in decision making. And oftentimes it's the most influential aspect of decision making.
All right. Like, very interesting stuff there. So my final question for you, and I have a hunch that we may have, sort of touched upon this already, but it's a question I'm going to ask everybody that comes on the show, I hope. If I were to say, here's the keys to COMM 1000 for a day, go ahead, teach the class, one lecture, anything you want, any topic, you've got a big audience, and anything in communication goes, what would you talk about?
Well, I've already mentioned emotional education, I think at least 3 different times.
Yes, you have.
So I would have to say that I would definitely give my expert lecture on emotional education. But I think it's also important to touch on something we haven't talked about, which is entertainment education. But so I would talk about emotional education as it relates to media, health, interpersonal interactions, etc.
And you've hinted at emotional education, and we're kind of leaving it out to some degree rather than getting too in detail on it, because we're going to talk about it in about 2 weeks when we get into emotion and nonverbal communication. And we're actually going to circle back around to this topic of entertainment education towards the end of the semester, when we start talking more about media and the ways in which people are using it that perhaps we're not as aware of. So perhaps you'll be our second repeat guest. We told Kyle Hull last week he'd be our first when we get back around to entertainment education, and you can come back on and we can talk about that a little bit more.
I would love to do that. Although the invitation's not really as special, since I'm the second one asked.
Okay, well, I apologize for that, but
I'm just joking.
You are the first one to go in depth on research topics, so we appreciate that here at the podcast. And overall, I think a good conversation, some things to talk about, really ties in really well with the material that we've been talking about in the course. She's a 4th-year PhD student. She'll soon be a doctor. She studies perception to some degree, gender to some degree, thin slicing to some degree, and emotional education to a very large degree. Sara Picklesimer, our guest today on podcast number 2. Sara, thank you so much for coming.
And thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you very much.
So once again, a special thanks to my guest, Sara Picklesimer, a fascinating conversation about perception and gender and thin slicing. We appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to sit in and listen on the podcast, episode number 2. Stay tuned next week when we start to talk about things like verbal and nonverbal communication and a little bit of visual communication. I'm your host, Steve Stifano. Thank you for listening, and take care. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the host and his guests. They do not reflect the views of the University of Connecticut, the UCONN Department of Communication, or the COMM 1000 course itself.